Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this is a paper run through for paper 2 and the historical investigation section, which covers the USA. It might also cover the First World War if you're doing that topic, and this is on question B of that. Question B is the sources question, so you get two sources A and B, on a common topic, for example the Prohibition, and you're asked to compare them. It should take you about 10 to 12 minutes, just like the question B on paper 1, and it's worth 8 marks in total. So, how do you answer question B? Firstly, you need to read through both the sources. They will often have completely different views about a topic, although sometimes they have a lot of similarities and they differ only a little bit. And you need to read them well, because you'll need to reference them in question C as well, so you need to know what they're saying. Bring highlighters to the exam, preferably of 2 different colours, so you can highlight anything that's similar between them and anything that's different. And find the points on which the 2 sources agree, and also the points where they differ. It's normal in most questions to have more, for example, differences than agreements, or more agreements than disagreements. It will often be biased towards one or the other. You're looking for 4 to 5 in total, so you might get 4 agreements and 1 disagreement, or it might be more even 2 and 3. What you'll need to do is you need to write a paragraph on the similarities, so the agreements between the 2 sources, then a paragraph on the disagreements, the differences, and then a conclusion finally to sum it up. You need to quote directly from the sources as well, and the conclusion sums up the extent to which source A supports source B. That's what the question will say. Or to what extent does source A support source B? And you need to think about the extent to which it does. So did they agree more than disagree? Did they disagree more than agree? That will influence what extent source A supports source B. So here are, for example, 2 sources. Alongside the source, they will also tell you where it comes from, for example, a newspaper, a textbook, a journal. This might be interesting. Really, it's not relevant, and you won't have to include it in the question. These 2 sources I've made up, just so I don't get hit with a copyright notice, but they give you an idea of what sort of things the sources will say in the real exam. So here's source A, for example, and this is about the opposition to the New Deal by the Supreme Court in the USA topic. So source A says, Roosevelt decided to pack the court with his own minions after the majority had voted against all his unconstitutional agencies. Unironically, Roosevelt, annoyed and embittered, responded to the court's claims that he was too powerful by pushing through Congress a bill that would let him stuff the court with 6 of his own men. Fortunately, it was voted down, and Roosevelt was left embarrassed, his latest attempt to become a dictator blocked. So, as you can see from this source, it's not very complimentary towards Roosevelt. It's scathing, it's not for him, it disagrees a lot with what he was doing. So that shows one opinion. Source B. After several frustrating judgments by the Supreme Court, which limited the abilities of alphabet agencies, Roosevelt rightly decided to try and sway the court by adding 6 judges who were on his side. Though seen by many as dictatorial, this was necessary if he was to keep the New Deal going, and ultimately proved successful as 2 judges began to vote for him and his policies. So that's a bit more positive. As you can see, 2 completely opposing viewpoints here. Source A, very much against Roosevelt, source B, for Roosevelt and what he was doing. And this will play into how we highlight it. So here we are, source A and source B. The yellow highlighted sections show the agreements between them. So you can see here that it's agreeing that the majority had voted against all his unconstitutional agencies, and in source B it says it limited the abilities of alphabet agencies. So they're both saying that the Supreme Court had tried to limit his agencies. The green ones show the differences, so rightly versus fortunately. You can show the difference between the tones through those 2 words. And here's just me summing it up. You don't need to do something like this in the exam, but it just gives you an idea of where they differ and where they agree. So the similarities, the Supreme Court was limiting the alphabet agencies, Roosevelt was annoyed, court packing was seen as dictatorial, The differences, source A says it was an embarrassment, B a success, A says it was wrong, B says it was right. And then finally, and this will be important for the conclusion, and this pushes you up into the top level descriptor, the extent to which they agree or disagree. So A has a completely opposite attitude to B, but they both agree with their details. So for example, the court was blocking all of Roosevelt's ideas. So there is some agreement on what they're saying, however, how they approach it and their attitude towards it is completely different. And that's what you need to pick up. This is very similar to like an English comprehension exercise. What's the attitude from each of the authors and how can you prove that? So this is an example of how the question will go. How far does source A support the evidence of source B about the Supreme Court? There are 3 paragraphs in this. Source A and B both agree that the Supreme Court had been limiting the ability of Roosevelt's alphabet agencies. Source A says that they had voted against all his unconstitutional agencies, and B corroborates this by saying the court limited the abilities of alphabet agencies, showing it took actions to reduce their powers. Moreover, they both agree on the effect this had on Roosevelt. Source A describes him as annoyed and embittered, and B says that the judgments were frustrating, suggesting that Roosevelt was angered by the court's decisions. They also agree that adding more judges to the court was worrisome. Source A describes it as Roosevelt's latest attempt to become a dictator, and Source B agrees with this by saying it was seen by many as dictatorial, showing that people were worried by his actions. However, the sources disagree about how successful this court packing was. Source A says that Roosevelt was left embarrassed, while Source B says that it ultimately proved successful when 2 judges began voting in his favour. Furthermore, the tones of the sources differ. Source A is scathing of Roosevelt, saying that he wanted to put his minions into the court, while Source B says that he did it rightly. In conclusion, whilst both sources do agree that the court had been blocking Roosevelt and this angered him, both sources mainly disagree because Source A is critical of Roosevelt and sees his actions as a failure, but Source B sees him as just and a success, so Source A does not support Source B. Just because of the space of the slide and how much time I had to do it, the second paragraph isn't as long as it could be, and maybe the first paragraph is a bit longer than it would be in the real thing. It depends on how you write it. So, how to get full marks? Firstly, you need to give both agreements and disagreements, preferably in different paragraphs, just to show that you've got agreements in one place and disagreements in the other, so the examiner can see you've tackled both of them. You need to quote directly from both sources, and you need to conclude with ideas about the extent of support. So that's the mark scheme there. You can see in the second level descriptor, both agreement and disagreement must be identified for 5 marks. So if you don't put agreements and disagreements, if you only tackle the agreements or only tackle the disagreements, you can only get 4 marks, half of them. You also need to make sure you quote directly, so you can see from answers offers valid comment that identifies agreement and or difference using sources. So you do need to quote directly from them. They shouldn't be long quotes, they can be a word minimum, but you need to make sure that you quote and you say exactly which source you got it from. Source A says that, whatever. You can see in level 3, answer provides an explained evaluation of the extent of support. The sources are cross-referred and comparisons used to support reasoning about the extent of support. So this means that you can't just talk about agreements and disagreements in order to get the top band, so 6 to 8 marks. You need to also talk about how far source A supports source B. So do they agree entirely? Do they disagree entirely? Is it more likely a mix? And also talking about what they're saying. So source A supports source B because they're saying the same things, for example. So there's the answer I just gave. And you can see why this is a very, very good answer. The red shows the signposting. I've got 3 clear paragraphs, one about agreement, one about disagreement, one about the extent of support, which tackles all the stuff in the mark scheme. Quotes in green, in quotation marks, that's crucial so that they can see that you are quoting directly from the sources. Also, I've included where it comes from. Source A says that, B says that, etc. The blue is the points of agreement or disagreement. They're given simply and succinctly. I'm not going on about it. You can just put them down in a few words. So why do they agree? Because they're saying that Roosevelt was annoyed by it. In the conclusion, the purple is the extent, so both sources do agree, but source A does not support source B, and the yellow is the justification for that, just describing it, why I'm putting that extent, because source A and source B mainly disagree in their tones and how they approach Roosevelt's actions. One says it's a success, one says it isn't. So breakdown of how to do it. First of all, highlight the similarities and differences in both of your sources. You don't need to quote everything you highlight, but it's a good idea to highlight as much as you think is important for the question. Then you can select which ones are best, and also the ones that all of the ones you've highlighted will be useful for question C. Write a paragraph on the agreements, then on the disagreements. So in each one, depending on how many agreements or disagreements you have, you should begin by stating what they agree or disagree on. So, for example, how Roosevelt felt about the Supreme Court blocking his agencies. Then give quotes from each source showing that. Source A says that, and source B corroborates this or agrees with this. So it's clear that you're referring to both. Then, in the final paragraph, it doesn't need to be long, just summarise by explaining how they agree, disagree, and then overall the extent to which source A supports source B, and this is vital in order to get 6 to 8 marks. This is a different question, just giving an idea of a conclusion for a question about the New Deal and how effective it was. So in conclusion, although the sources both disagree about the extent to which the New Deal was effective, with source A saying that it did not do enough to improve lives, that it did enough to improve lives, and source B saying that it did not go far enough. Overall, source A strongly supports source B because they both mention that the New Deal succeeded in its original aims by reforming the banking system and helping America to recover from the Depression. So what makes this good? It gives both sides of the argument, so saying how they disagree and how they agree. It says briefly how they agree or disagree, so that A says it did go far enough, and source B saying that it didn't. And then it sums up the extent to which they agree. So source A strongly supports. Those are the sort of adverbs you're looking for: strongly, weakly, etc., broadly. Just saying how much it supports or does not support source B. I've got a few top tips for question B and doing well in this. Firstly, similarities and differences can be quite broad. So, for example, both source A and B agree that there was lots of damage done is a perfectly valid similarity. You could also say that in regards to the prohibition, both source A and source B thought that it was being broken by senior politicians. It doesn't have to be really, really broad. It can be quite specified as well, but make sure you talk about both the similarities and the differences. 4 to 5 in total is completely enough as long as you explain them well and quote. State clearly which source you're quoting from. Don't just say both of them talk about how Roosevelt felt about the Supreme Court. One says that he was embittered. No, you need to put which source it was that you got it from and do quote so it shows specifically that you are referring to the source. Quotes can be a word, it could be 2 words, that's often the most effective, but it should not be reaching a sentence or long phrases because then the examiner doesn't know what you're picking up on. You need to make sure it's succinct. It doesn't matter if it's only a word in total, that's enough. They just need to see that you're referring to the sources and make sure you use quotation marks for that, of course. Again, there's a mistake that some people make, like they did in paper 1 question A, where you overanalyze it and you analyze them like an English essay, not a historical one. You don't need to constantly refer to things like this adjective says that Roosevelt felt very, etc. You can just quote it and that's enough. You don't even need to explain it very much. If you said Roosevelt was, quote, annoyed, that's the end. You don't need to explain it further. It's obvious what that means. You're not looking about how the author creates effects or anything similar. Don't treat it like an English essay, it's historical. Use connectives throughout. This is really good. It just separates your points. So furthermore, it shows that you're dealing with several different agreements and disagreements. And always talk about the extent in the conclusion. Whilst both sources agree that, overall they broadly disagree because, and then always describing it and explaining your judgments. There's a few more top tips. Just like you shouldn't talk about it like an English essay, don't be over historical either. You will be given underneath the sources where the sources come from. So it comes from a newspaper written shortly after the time, a textbook written 100 years later, whatever. That doesn't matter. You don't need to talk about bias or reliability or prejudice of the sources in this. So don't say because source A was written at the time, it's more likely to be accurate than source B. That's not what they're looking for in this question at all. It's irrelevant and it wastes your time. You do need to speed through question B because question C is the one that's going to take most of your time. Don't use your own knowledge in this one. That's specifically for question A and for question C. Facts, information, etc. are good to know, obviously, but you should not be talking about it in this section. It's a waste of time. It won't get you marks. You just need to focus on what the sources are saying. You don't need to say, oh, but this isn't accurate because whatever. No. Source A says this, source B says that. That's everything you need to do for this question. And finally, just highlight the most important quotes in the sources. Don't highlight the entire source, but highlight what's important, preferably with two different ones to show the differing opinions. And this will really, really help you in question C because you don't have time to keep rereading sources A and B. If you've just got the highlighted stuff, you can select that and plot them in your essay for question C. And you will find that you will be reusing the same quotes for question B and C. That's fine, that's completely normal because there will be some sections that are completely irrelevant in the sources and there will be some really, really good quotes that show your point. The topic in question B and C is exactly the same. If it's on the Supreme Court opposition in question B, it will be on exactly the same thing in question C. So don't be afraid to reuse those quotes. And that's everything for this All You Need Notes paper run through of Edexcel IGCSE History, paper 2, question B. I hope you found this useful. If you have, please do comment and let me know, and like and subscribe. And I will see you in the next video on question C. Thank you.